She was 19 years old, a proud member of the Hali-Wasaponi Native American tribe, and a biology major at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Bright, driven, and full of life, she hoped to become a pediatrician. Education, to Faith, wasn't just a goal. It was a promise she had made to her late mother and a future she was building for her community. Before we continue, if stories like this matter to you, don't forget to like this video, share, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell so you never miss a case. Faith Hedgepeth carried her dreams with determination. Friends described her as someone who lit up every room, a young woman who balanced her studies with a love for her culture and friendships. But on the morning of September 7th, 2012, those dreams were stolen in the most brutal way. That day began like any other in Chapel Hill. Students moved across campus, clutching coffee cups and backpacks, preparing for another day of classes. But before noon, the campus was buzzing with devastating news. One of their own had been murdered. Inside a modest apartment at the Hawthorne at the View complex, Faith's body was found by her roommate, Karina Rosario. The scene inside was horrifying. Blood spattered across her room. Her injuries were severe, the result of blunt force trauma. And while the violence was unmistakable, one detail immediately unsettled investigators. There were no signs of forced entry. Had Faith known her killer? Had she opened the door willingly, unaware of the danger she faced? Police cordoned off the apartment and began gathering evidence. The crime scene told a disturbing story, one of rage, chaos, and unanswered questions. Detectives recovered DNA, including semen, that would later prove critical. They also found a chilling note, scribbled across a fast food bag. "I'm not stupid. Be jealous." Was it left by the killer in anger or planted as a cruel distraction? Faith's murder shocked not only Chapel Hill but also her hometown of Hollister, North Carolina. Her mother, Connie, described her daughter as her best friend. Her father, Roland, called her the heartbeat of their family. For them, this was not just a crime scene. It was the devastating loss of a child with a bright future. By afternoon, the story was everywhere. Students locked doors they normally left open. Parents flooded their children with phone calls. And detectives began working through the endless question: who would want Faith dead? The brutality suggested a personal motive, but the lack of immediate suspects made the case even more chilling. A young woman, loved and admired, had been slain in her own bedroom, and her killer had slipped away without a trace. That September morning marked the beginning of a decade-long pursuit of justice. For investigators, it was a race against time. For Faith's family, it was the start of a nightmare that would not let go. What do you think is most haunting about the opening of this case? The violent nature of the attack, or the fact there was no forced entry? In the hours after Faith Hedgepeth's body was found, Chapel Hill police began the urgent task of retracing her final night. The brutality of the crime had left them with one undeniable fact. Whoever killed Faith had been inside her apartment between the early morning hours and late morning of September 7th, 2012. The question was, how did they get there? Faith's last known hours began the evening before. On September 6th, she attended a sorority interest meeting for Alpha Pi Omega, the nation's oldest Native American sorority. Faith was deeply proud of her heritage, and joining the group was something that mattered to her. Afterward, she and her roommate, Karina Rosario, returned to their shared apartment at Hawthorne at the View. Later that night, the two went back out. Around midnight, they headed downtown to the Thrill, a popular nightclub. Though underage, Faith managed to get inside, and surveillance cameras confirmed their presence there. Friends later recalled seeing her dancing, smiling, and moving through the crowded club like any other college student enjoying the night. Nothing suggested danger was waiting for her. By about 2 a.m., the women left and returned to their apartment. But soon after, Karina wasn't feeling well. Faith, ever caring, encouraged her to go spend the night with her boyfriend, UNC soccer player Jordan McCrary. Karina agreed and left, leaving Faith alone in the apartment. That decision would become one of the most haunting details of the case. Between 3 a.m., when Karina left, and 11 a.m., when she returned, Something horrific had unfolded. When Karina came back later that morning, the front door was unlocked. Inside, she found Faith. The blood, the violence, the lifeless body of her best friend. It was too much to process. Karina dialed 911, her voice trembling as she tried to describe the scene. At one point she said, "She's unconscious." Another friend who had come with her whispered words no one wanted to hear, "It looks like she's dead." For investigators, the details were troubling. The lack of forced entry suggested Faith either let someone in willingly or her killer knew how to enter without breaking anything. Was it a friend? A classmate? Someone who had been watching her? Then came the note. On a fast food bag near Faith's body, someone had scrawled a message. "I'm not stupid. Be jealous." The words were strange, angry, and left investigators wondering if jealousy had been a motive. Even more critical was the forensic evidence. Semen was recovered from the scene, and DNA testing quickly produced a strong profile. It was their most promising lead, but when the profile was run through national databases, no match appeared. Whoever the killer was, they had no prior record in the system. The first round of questioning focused on those closest to Faith. Karina was questioned multiple times. Jordan McCrary was also investigated and provided DNA, which did not match. Detectives ruled them out, but the lack of suspects only deepened the mystery. Back in Hollister, Faith's family was overcome with grief. Her mother Connie described Faith as her best friend, while her father Roland struggled to process the sudden loss of a daughter who had been the light of his life. On campus, students who once felt safe walking at night began locking their doors. Rumors spread quickly, and fear gripped Chapel Hill. The DNA was a beacon of hope, but without a name to match, investigators were left chasing shadows. Do you think Faith's killer was someone who had been watching her that night, or someone she already knew and trusted? The first 24 hours of any homicide investigation are critical. For police in Chapel Hill, the urgency surrounding Faith Hedgepeth's murder was heightened by the brutality of the crime and the fact that it had occurred in a quiet apartment complex near the university. Faith wasn't a nameless victim. She was a vibrant college student with a bright future, and her death demanded answers. Investigators began by locking down the timeline. Surveillance cameras at the Thrill nightclub confirmed Faith and Karina Rosario had been there on the night of September 6th, leaving just before closing. By 2:30 a.m., they were back at their apartment. Not long after, Karina told police she began feeling sick. Faith urged her to go to Jordan McCrary's place, and Karina left. It was the last confirmed time Faith was seen alive. By 11 a.m. the next morning, Karina returned to an unlocked door and the horrific discovery that would unravel the campus community. Detectives zeroed in on the 911 call Karina made. Her trembling voice described what she believed was her unconscious roommate. In the background, a friend who had entered the apartment with her could be heard saying, "It looks like she's dead." The chilling recording was one of the first glimpses the public got into the horror of that morning. Back inside the apartment, investigators documented everything. The blood patterns told the story of a vicious assault. Faith had suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head. The ferocity of the attack suggested intense rage. And then there was the fast food bag with the handwritten words, "I'm not stupid. Be jealous." Detectives weren't sure what to make of it. Was it a genuine message from the killer, or a staged attempt to throw them off? Forensic teams quickly recovered semen from the scene, and DNA testing produced a complete profile. It was a critical piece of evidence, one that could solve the case in an instant if it matched someone in the system. But when they ran it through CODIS, the national DNA database, no hits came back. The killer had never been arrested before. Attention turned to the people closest to Faith. Karina was thoroughly questioned. Some in the community speculated about her role, but detectives found no evidence she was involved. Jordan McCrary, her boyfriend, was also interviewed. He provided DNA which did not match the profile. Other friends and acquaintances were asked for alibis. Each time, the DNA cleared them. While the forensic evidence ruled people out, it also narrowed the field, but without a match, investigators were stuck. Faith's family, devastated, traveled from Hollister to Chapel Hill. Her father, Roland, said he couldn't understand how someone could do this to his daughter. Her mother, Connie, described Faith as her best friend and said her life had revolved around her children. The grief in their voices underscored the urgency of finding justice. Meanwhile, the community reeled. Students whispered theories in dorm hallways. Professors noticed the weight of fear hanging over classrooms. Parents called their children nonstop, terrified the killer could strike again. Despite the strong DNA evidence, the case was already showing signs of difficulty. Detectives had a profile of the killer but no name, no face, and no clear motive. Faith's murder had become more than just a local case. It was now a mystery that would linger for years, tormenting investigators and leaving her family to wonder if justice would ever come. Do you believe the note left at the scene was the killer's genuine outburst? Or was it a deliberate attempt to stage the crime scene? As days turned into weeks after Faith Hedgepeth's murder, frustration began to seep into every corner of the investigation. Detectives had collected a wealth of evidence from the apartment: DNA, fingerprints, blood patterns, and the mysterious handwritten note. But nothing was leading to a name. The DNA profile was their strongest lead. It was clear, uncontaminated, and capable of identifying the killer in an instant if a match appeared in Cody's. Yet every time investigators checked, the results came back the same. No match found. It was like chasing a ghost. To keep momentum, police began appealing to the public. They released limited details, hoping that someone might recognize something strange about that night. At first, they kept the DNA evidence quiet, choosing instead to highlight what could draw tips. The fast food bag with its haunting message, "I'm not stupid, be jealous," was one of those details. When it became public, it sparked endless speculation. Some believed the words reflected jealousy in a love triangle. Others thought it was an intentional red herring. The Chapel Hill Police Department faced immense pressure. Students at UNC were terrified, parents demanded answers, and Faith's family pleaded for justice. The silence from investigators only fueled rumors. Was the killer still on campus? Had they already questioned him without realizing it? Behind the scenes, police worked methodically. Dozens of people were interviewed. DNA samples were collected from potential suspects, each one compared to the profile left at the crime scene. Again and again, the results came back negative. The DNA was eliminating suspects, but it wasn't bringing them any closer to the truth. The lack of progress took a heavy toll on Faith's loved ones. Her father, Roland, publicly begged for answers. Her mother, Connie, said she could barely sleep, haunted by the image of her daughter's last moments. In Hollister, a small community that cherished Faith as one of their brightest lights, grief turned into anger. How could such a promising life be stolen with no one held accountable? Investigators also faced mounting criticism from the public. Some accused them of holding back too much information. Others believed the case had stalled because of mistakes in the early hours of evidence collection. The pressure weighed heavily on Chapel Hill police, but they insisted they were following every lead and working closely with the State Bureau of Investigation. Meanwhile, students at UNC began living with a new sense of fear. Dorm doors that had once been left open were now locked at all times. Social gatherings were shadowed by unease, and the question lingered in every corner of campus. Was Faith's killer someone they knew? By late 2012, the case was slipping into uncertainty. Detectives had evidence, but no identity. They had motive theories, but no suspect. Faith's murder was becoming one of the most perplexing cases in Chapel Hill history. For her family, every day without answers was agony. Faith had dreamed of helping children as a pediatrician, of giving back to the community that had raised her. Now, instead of celebrating her achievements, they were fighting to keep her memory alive and demanding justice that always seemed just out of reach. This was no longer just an investigation. It was becoming a test of patience, resilience, and hope. Do you think investigators were right to hold back details from the public? Or should they have shared more information in hopes of finding Faith's killer sooner? If you want to follow every step of this heartbreaking case, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. Months passed after the murder of Faith Hedgepeth, and the silence surrounding the case grew heavier. In Hollister, North Carolina, her family struggled with the reality that her killer was still out there. At UNC Chapel Hill, classmates and professors carried the weight of grief into classrooms and dormitories. For the investigators, the unanswered questions became a daily burden. The DNA profile remained their strongest piece of evidence, but without a match in Cody's, detectives had no name, no face, and no way to narrow their search beyond speculation. They collected dozens of samples from people connected to Faith, each one eliminating another potential suspect. While the DNA cleared those closest to her, it also left detectives with fewer leads. For the public, frustration mounted. Rumors spread across the UNC campus and beyond. Some whispered that the case had stalled because of investigative mistakes. Others believed police were withholding too much. In reality, detectives were in a bind. Releasing too much could compromise the case, but holding back left the community in the dark. In 2013, Chapel Hill police took an unusual step. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in DNA phenotyping, using genetic material to create a snapshot of a suspect's physical traits. From the DNA left at the crime scene, Parabon generated a profile suggesting the suspect was likely male, of Native American and European ancestry, with specific facial features and hair color probabilities. When this information was released, it reignited public interest. The sketch based on phenotyping didn't provide a name, but it gave the community a face to imagine. A reminder that Faith's killer was real, not just a faceless shadow. For Faith's family, the release was bittersweet. On one hand, it was progress. On the other, it was a reminder of how far they still were from justice. Connie Hedgepeth described the weight as unbearable. Each day without answers was another day stolen from her daughter's memory. Meanwhile, investigators continued chasing tips. They re-interviewed witnesses, looked again at Faith's movements the night before her murder, and tested more DNA samples. Still, the case remained unsolved. The years dragged on. Anniversaries of Faith's death came and went, marked by vigils on campus where candles flickered against the night sky. Students who hadn't even known Faith still gathered, honoring her memory and standing in solidarity with her family. But behind every candlelight vigil was the same haunting truth. Her killer was still free. In the background, the case file grew thicker. Detectives refused to close it, insisting that the DNA was the key. They just had to wait for technology or circumstance to catch up. But for Faith's loved ones, waiting was its own kind of torment. By the mid-2010s, the murder of Faith Hedgepeth had become one of North Carolina's most notorious unsolved cases. It carried all the elements of a haunting mystery. A bright young victim, a brutal crime, tantalizing evidence, and yet no suspect identified. Faith's dreams of becoming a pediatrician, of helping children and honoring her heritage, had been silenced. But her story was far from over. Behind the scenes, technology was advancing, and new methods of DNA analysis were on the horizon. Methods that would one day change everything. If you were in Faith's family's position, would the release of a DNA-based sketch give you hope, or only deepen the frustration of not having a name? By the time a year had passed since Faith Hedgepeth's murder, the weight of silence had become unbearable. On September 7, 2013, her family and friends gathered at UNC for a candlelight vigil, just as they had months earlier. Candles flickered in the darkness as classmates whispered prayers, and Faith's parents clutched photos of their daughter. For them, the grief never lessened. It deepened. The investigation had not stopped, but it had stalled. Detectives had interviewed dozens of people, tested DNA samples, and studied the crime scene evidence over and over. Still, the killer's identity remained hidden. The note found at the scene had offered little clarity. The DNA profile remained unmatched, and the questions of motive, jealousy, rage, opportunity, swirled endlessly without resolution. For the Hedgepeth family, each passing day without answers felt like justice slipping further away. Connie, Faith's mother, described the pain as living with a hole in her heart. Roland, her father, admitted he struggled to understand how someone could commit such violence and still walk free. Their words carried a heaviness that echoed across the small community of Hollister, where Faith's absence was felt at every gathering, every holiday, every moment that should have been joyful. At UNC, students kept Faith's name alive. Her sorority sisters in Alpha Pi Omega honored her memory at events. Professors remembered her as a promising student with a bright mind. Yet for new students arriving on campus each year, her story became part of a whispered warning, a reminder that even a seemingly safe college town could be shaken by unimaginable violence. By 2014, investigators faced mounting criticism. Some questioned whether the case had been mishandled in the first hours after the discovery. Others wondered if leads had gone cold because of too much secrecy. Detectives, however, stood firm. The case was active and the DNA was the key. They believed it was only a matter of time before the profile found its match. But time dragged on. In 2016, nearly 4 years after Faith's death, police released more information to the public. They confirmed that semen had been recovered and that it produced a clear DNA profile of the suspect. To keep the investigation alive, they again worked with Parabon Nanolabs, refining the composite sketch based on genetic traits. The image was updated, showing a young male of Native American and European ancestry. Police hoped the sketch would spark recognition in someone, somewhere. For Faith's family, the release was a double-edged sword. It was proof that progress was still possible, but it also highlighted how much time had already been lost. Her sister later said, "Every year that goes by, it feels like we lose her again." Despite vigils, media coverage, and the release of the DNA composite, no name emerged. The suspect's face might have been sketched by science, but without a match, he was still invisible in the eyes of the law. The Hedgepeths never stopped pushing. They spoke at memorials, gave interviews, and reminded anyone who would listen that Faith was more than just a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a young woman whose future had been stolen. By the late 2010s, the case had become one of Chapel Hill's most enduring mysteries. To some, it seemed destined to remain unsolved. But behind the scenes, technology was advancing rapidly, and investigators were quietly preparing for the day when science could finally reveal the name that had eluded them for so long. If years passed without justice for your loved one, would you hold on to hope, or begin to believe the truth might never come out? By the time the 5th anniversary of Faith Hedgepeth's murder arrived in 2017, her name had become both a symbol of heartbreak and a rallying cry for justice. Each year, friends, family, and members of the UNC community gathered to remember her. They lit candles, shared stories of her warmth and ambition, and prayed that the person who ended her life would finally be held accountable. For her family, the passage of time did not soften the pain. Faith's mother, Connie, often described her grief as living with an open wound that never heals. Her father, Roland, struggled with the unanswered question that haunted him most. Why Faith? At vigils, classmates spoke of the friend who lit up rooms with her smile. Professors remembered her potential. Members of the Hali-Wasaponi tribe described her as a source of pride, a young woman destined to give back to her people. Instead, her life had been brutally stolen. The investigation had not stopped, but years of frustration weighed on both detectives and the community. Police continued to remind the public that they had a DNA profile of the suspect. It was strong, definitive, but without a name, it was like holding a key with no lock. To keep momentum alive, Chapel Hill police once again turned to technology. They partnered with Parabon Nanolabs for a more detailed analysis of the suspect's genetic profile. The result was an updated composite image released in 2016. It depicted a young male, likely of mixed ancestry, with traits predicted from DNA. Investigators hoped someone might see the image and recognize him. But no name came. For the Hedgepeth family, the public release was bittersweet. On one hand, it proved police were still working. On the other, it underscored the painful reality that years had passed without an arrest. Connie later said she held onto her faith because it was all she had left. By 2017, Faith's case had become one of the most high-profile unsolved murders in North Carolina. News outlets revisited the story each September. Social media kept her name alive, with hashtags demanding justice. Yet inside the Chapel Hill Police Department, the case remained frustratingly cold. Detectives pored over files, hoping they had missed something. They re-interviewed witnesses, retested evidence, and checked the DNA profile against new entries in Cody's. Still, the match never came. The weight of the years showed in the eyes of Faith's family during interviews. They spoke of milestones she would never reach: graduating college, starting her career, raising her own family. Those dreams had died with her in 2012, and the lack of justice made the loss feel even crueler. But technology was moving forward. New forensic methods were being developed across the country, and law enforcement was beginning to see breakthroughs in cold cases once thought unsolvable. For the Hedgepeths, hope flickered in those advances. Maybe it was only a matter of time before Faith's case would finally break open. Still, 5 years after her murder, the killer remained a faceless shadow. Someone out there knew the truth. Someone out there had walked away from that apartment on September 7, 2012, and managed to remain hidden for years. The question was, how much longer could he hide? If you were in Faith's family's place, would the annual vigils bring you comfort, or serve as painful reminders of how long justice had been delayed? By 2018, the murder of Faith Hedgepeth had become one of the most frustrating cold cases in North Carolina. 6 years had passed, and still there was no arrest. Her family's grief was constant, and the community's patience was thinning. But behind the scenes, science was catching up to the evidence that had been waiting since the morning Faith's body was discovered. The DNA collected from the crime scene had always been the most important clue. For years, investigators ran it through Cody's, hoping it would match someone already in the system. Each attempt came back the same: no match. But technology had advanced, and detectives were ready to try something new. In 2016, Chapel Hill police had released the Parabon Nanolab's composite sketch of a possible suspect based on DNA phenotyping. It showed a man of Native American and European ancestry, with predictions for his eye color, hair color, and facial shape. For the first time, the community had a face to imagine. Still, it wasn't enough. The sketch didn't give investigators a name, and tips that came in led nowhere. But by the late 2010s, investigative genetic genealogy, the same method that had identified the Golden State Killer in California, was changing the landscape of unsolved crimes. By comparing DNA profiles against public genealogy databases, investigators could begin tracing family trees, building connections, and narrowing down suspects. Faith's case was a candidate for this new method. Chapel Hill police worked with experts, quietly reanalyzing the DNA profile using these tools. They began to identify possible family members of the suspect, working backward to narrow the pool. It was slow, methodical work, but it gave detectives something they had not had in years: forward motion. For Faith's family, hope began to flicker again. Each year at vigils, they spoke not only of their grief but also of their faith in the investigators. "We just want to know who did this," Connie Hedgepeth told reporters. "We want justice for Faith." The pressure never faded. Every news update brought renewed attention. Every anniversary reignited the pain. The case was now not just a North Carolina story. It was known nationally, often cited as an example of how DNA evidence can hold the truth, waiting for science to unlock it. Meanwhile, the suspect's profile loomed in the background. He was out there, living, walking, perhaps blending in as an ordinary man. But his DNA had already betrayed him. It was only a matter of time before his identity was revealed. 6 years after Faith's murder, the long road to justice was finally beginning to bend toward answers. Do you think the release of DNA composites and genealogy work would pressure a killer into making mistakes, or only make him more careful to stay hidden? If you want to keep following this powerful story of justice delayed but not denied, make sure to like, share, subscribe, and click the notification bell. By the late 2010s, the murder of Faith Hedgepeth was no longer just a case file gathering dust. It was a test of persistence. For 6 long years, detectives in Chapel Hill had returned to the same evidence: the DNA profile, the violent crime scene, and the cryptic note. Each time they hoped for a break. Each time they were left staring into the void. But something had shifted. The rise of investigative genetic genealogy gave police a new tool. Instead of waiting for a suspect's DNA to appear in Cody's, they could now search public genealogy databases to trace relatives of the unknown suspect. From there, investigators could build family trees and start narrowing down possible names. The process was grueling. Detectives partnered with experts, comparing Faith's killer's DNA profile against thousands of entries. The first results showed distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, but it was enough to begin mapping connections. Slowly, the web began to tighten. For Faith's family, the silence was still painful. Each year, at memorials and vigils, they prayed for a break. Connie Hedgepeth often said she lived with a constant ache, knowing her daughter's killer had walked free for so many years. For her father, Roland, hope was harder to hold on to. Yet he remained steadfast that one day, someone would have to answer for what had been done. Meanwhile, the public never forgot. True crime communities online shared Faith's story. Local and national media revisited the case on anniversaries. Her sorority sisters in Alpha Pi Omega continued to honor her memory. Faith's presence lingered, even in absence. By 2019, investigators were quietly moving closer. Genetic genealogy had pointed them toward possible family groups in North Carolina. Names began to appear in files, men who could not be ruled out until their DNA was tested. Detectives worked carefully, knowing that one wrong step could compromise the case. The slow pace was frustrating for those on the outside, but inside the investigation, there was a sense of growing inevitability. For the first time since 2012, detectives weren't just eliminating suspects. They were closing in on someone who might finally match. Faith's family, though unaware of the full progress behind the scenes, clung to their faith. "I believe God will reveal this when the time is right," Connie said in an interview. Her words carried both grief and quiet determination. The suspect's DNA had waited for years, silent and damning. Now, with each new technological advance, the walls around him were closing in. The question was no longer if he would be identified, but when. If you knew DNA evidence had been sitting in a lab for years, waiting for science to catch up, would that give you comfort, or make the wait for justice even harder? By 2019, whispers of progress had begun to stir behind the closed doors of the Chapel Hill Police Department. For years, the DNA profile left at the crime scene had been the silent witness no one could ignore. It held the truth of who had taken Faith Hedgepeth's life, and finally, technology was catching up to what science had preserved. Through investigative genetic genealogy, detectives had begun building family trees linked to the suspect's DNA. The process required patience, comparing genetic markers from distant relatives, sometimes third or fourth cousins, and slowly mapping out generations. Each new branch narrowed the possibilities. Each step brought them closer to one man. The work was slow, meticulous, and confidential. Detectives couldn't risk tipping off the suspect. They knew whoever killed Faith had lived with the secret for years. He might have blended into ordinary life, never imagining the DNA he left behind would one day betray him. In Hollister, the Hedgepeth family endured the weight of time. By the 7th anniversary of Faith's death, her loved ones gathered once more at vigils. Connie Hedgepeth lit a candle, her face etched with grief but also determination. "We just want answers," she told reporters. "Faith deserves that." Her words echoed through the crowd, as classmates and community members bowed their heads in silence. On campus at UNC, Faith's story remained alive. Students who hadn't even known her spoke her name at vigils. Professors remembered her potential, her ambition, her kindness. Her sorority sisters in Alpha Pi Omega made sure she was not forgotten. For many, Faith was no longer just a classmate or friend. She had become a symbol of perseverance, a reminder of the fight for justice that could not be abandoned. As investigators closed in, they quietly began comparing DNA from individuals identified through genealogy. Names were now attached to the family tree. Each time a new person was ruled out, the pool grew smaller. By 2020, the list was down to just a handful of possibilities. The case that once felt frozen was beginning to move again. Detectives didn't release details to the public, but inside the department, there was a growing sense of momentum. They believed they were finally approaching the moment they had waited for since 2012, identifying Faith's killer. Still, the wait was agonizing for her family. Each year that passed was another year stolen from Faith's life. She would have graduated, perhaps begun medical school, maybe even started the path toward becoming the pediatrician she dreamed of being. Instead, all her family had were memories, candles, and prayers. The suspect, unknown to the public, was living his life in the shadows of freedom. But his time was running out. The DNA he had left behind in Faith's bedroom was a thread he could never erase. Investigators had finally begun to pull it, and the unraveling had already begun. Do you think Faith's killer ever believed he had gotten away with it? Or did he live with the constant fear that one day DNA would catch up to him? Nearly a decade had passed since the murder of Faith Hedgepeth, and for years, it had seemed as though her killer had vanished into thin air. But behind the scenes, Chapel Hill police and their partners were quietly closing in. The suspect's DNA had been sitting in evidence since 2012, waiting, and now genealogy was tightening the circle around him. Detectives had built family trees that pointed them toward a group of men in North Carolina. Each step of the process meant locating potential relatives, checking alibis, and testing DNA when possible. Slowly, the suspect pool shrank until the focus was on one man. His name, Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares. Born in Guatemala and living in Durham, North Carolina, Salguero Olivares was 28 years old at the time of his arrest in 2021. But in 2012, when Faith was murdered, he had been 19, close in age to Faith, and not on anyone's radar in the early investigation. He wasn't a student at UNC, and his name had never surfaced in the original interviews. For years, he had lived his life under the illusion of safety. Investigators quietly collected a DNA sample from him. When the results came back, they had their answer. It was a perfect match to the DNA left at the crime scene. After nearly 9 years of frustration, the identity of Faith's killer was no longer a mystery. For detectives who had worked the case from the beginning, it was both relief and disbelief. The man who had haunted their investigation was not a friend, not a classmate, not anyone they had seriously suspected. He was an outsider, hidden in plain sight, living just a short drive from where Faith's body had been found. When the news reached Faith's family, the emotions were overwhelming. Connie Hedgepeth said she had prayed every day for justice and thanked investigators for never giving up. "When I got the call," she later recalled, "I just cried. Tears of relief, tears of pain, tears because I knew Faith was finally getting her voice back." The announcement shook Chapel Hill. For nearly a decade, the case had been a shadow over the community. Now, at last, there was a name, a face, and an arrest. The man who thought he had gotten away with murder was now in custody, facing charges of first-degree murder and sexual assault. Still, for many, the relief was mixed with anger. Why had it taken 9 years? How had Salguero Olivares avoided suspicion for so long? Would justice have come sooner if new technology had been available earlier? For Faith's family, those questions mattered less than the fact that an arrest had finally been made. They had waited through endless nights of grief, stood at vigils year after year, and begged the world not to forget. Now they had hope that the courts would deliver the justice they had long prayed for. After 9 long years, the man who took Faith's life could no longer hide. Do you think Faith's killer managed to live freely for 9 years without guilt? Or did the weight of what he'd done haunt him every single day? On September 16, 2021, nearly 9 years after Faith Hedgepeth was murdered, Chapel Hill police stood before cameras to make the announcement her family had been waiting for. An arrest had been made. The suspect was 28-year-old Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares of Durham, North Carolina. His DNA matched the profile collected from Faith's apartment in 2012. After years of uncertainty, the case that had haunted Chapel Hill and devastated the Hedgepeth family finally had a name attached to it. For investigators, the moment was surreal. The case had consumed thousands of hours, countless interviews, and years of frustration. Now, the DNA that had been sitting in evidence from the very beginning had delivered the breakthrough they had always promised would come. When news of the arrest broke, Faith's family wept. Her mother, Connie, spoke through tears. "When I got the call, I just cried. I didn't know what else to do. We've waited 9 years for this. Faith has her voice back now." Her father, Roland, echoed her words, calling the arrest a blessing but reminding the world that nothing could bring back his daughter. The arrest sent shockwaves across UNC's campus and beyond. For nearly a decade, Faith's murder had been one of the most infamous unsolved cases in the state. Vigils had been held, sketches had been released, DNA composites had been circulated, all without a name. Now, the man accused of taking her life was in custody. Salguero Olivares had no significant criminal history that would have placed his DNA in the system earlier. That was why it had taken nearly 9 years of technological progress to finally connect him to the crime scene. The news left many wondering how many other cold cases might one day be solved with the same methods. For Faith's sorority sisters in Alpha Pi Omega, the arrest was bittersweet. They had fought to keep her name alive, year after year, praying that justice would one day arrive. "It doesn't erase the pain," one said, "but at least now there's accountability." Reporters swarmed the story. National outlets picked it up, framing it as another example of how investigative genealogy was changing the future of unsolved crimes. But beyond the headlines, the heart of the case remained the same. A young woman, full of promise, whose life had been stolen. Her family's grief did not lessen with the arrest, but it shifted. No longer did they have to wonder who had done this. Now they could begin the long process of facing him in court. Faith's story was no longer just about tragedy. It was about resilience, hope, and the relentless pursuit of justice. After nearly a decade of silence, do you think the arrest brought Faith's family peace? Or only reopened wounds they had been forced to live with for so long? Faith's family waited 9 long years for this moment. If you believe her story deserves to be heard until the very end, stand with them. Like this video, share it, and subscribe. And don't forget to click the notification bell. The arrest of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares in September 2021 brought relief, but it also marked the beginning of a long, painful legal process. For nearly 9 years, the Hedgepeth family had prayed for answers. Now, they would face the man accused of taking Faith's life. Court documents revealed that Salguero Olivares was charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault. The DNA evidence was undeniable. It matched perfectly with what investigators had collected at the crime scene in 2012. For detectives, the strength of the DNA case was a victory. For Faith's family, it was a confirmation of what they had been told for years. The science would eventually bring them the truth. But trials in America are slow, and the road to justice would not be quick. After the arrest, the case entered a series of pretrial hearings. Attorneys reviewed evidence, motions were filed, and the court began preparing for what promised to be a long, complex trial. Each hearing was a painful reminder for the Hedgepeth family. They sat in the courtroom, forced to look at the man accused of killing their daughter, knowing that justice was still months, perhaps years, away. The community reacted with mixed emotions. On one hand, there was relief. The killer had a name and he was behind bars. On the other, there was anger and sorrow. Why had it taken so long? Why had Faith's family been forced to endure nearly a decade of uncertainty? For many students and alumni at UNC, the arrest brought back the memories of those fearful days in 2012, when doors were locked and whispers of the unsolved murder lingered across campus. News outlets across the country covered the story, framing it as a breakthrough in forensic science and a testament to the persistence of investigators. True crime communities online dissected every new court filing, every statement from police, every detail of the suspect's background. But for Faith's loved ones, the focus was never on the headlines. It was on her memory, her smile, her ambition, her dreams. Her sorority sisters at Alpha Pi Omega continued to honor her at every gathering. Her professors remembered the young woman who had wanted to become a pediatrician. And in Hollister, her family still set a place for her at the table, still lit candles, still prayed for strength. Faith had been more than a victim. She had been a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a symbol of hope for her community. And now, even with an arrest, her absence was a wound that could never fully heal. As the legal process moved forward, one thing was certain: her story was far from over. The arrest was not the end. It was the beginning of another chapter, one where Faith's family would have to relive the details of her final hours in a courtroom, facing the man accused of taking her life. Do Do you believe the arrest of a suspect provides families with closure, or does true closure only come after a trial and conviction? The arrest of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares in 2021 was a milestone, but it was not the end. For Faith Hedgepeth's family, the years of waiting had shifted into a new kind of struggle, navigating the slow, painstaking legal process. Pre-trial hearings began, and attorneys for both sides combed through the evidence. The prosecution leaned heavily on the DNA match, calling it definitive and irrefutable. Investigators had collected it in 2012, preserved it carefully, and finally matched it to Salguero Olivares nearly a decade later. The science was strong, but the law required more than certainty. It required procedure, argument, and patience. Delays soon followed. The pandemic had already slowed the courts, and the backlog of cases made scheduling difficult. Hearings were postponed. Motions were filed. Each step forward seemed to come with 2 steps back. For Faith's parents, sitting in the courtroom and waiting for progress was like reopening a wound that had never healed. Connie Hedgepeth spoke openly about the toll. She described the grief as something that lived with her every day, a shadow she could not escape. "You think it gets easier," she said in one interview, "but then you're reminded of what happened, and it's like reliving it all over again." The defense, meanwhile, began preparing their strategy. Though the DNA evidence was powerful, they explored angles to challenge the chain of custody, to question investigative methods, and to probe every detail of the original crime scene handling. For Faith's family, it was agonizing to hear her case reduced to motions and arguments. Outside the courtroom, the community remained engaged. News of each hearing spread quickly. True crime followers across the country tracked the updates. At UNC, vigils continued each September, with students, many of whom had been in elementary or middle school when Faith died, holding candles in her memory. Her story was no longer just a case file. It had become part of the university's history. What weighed most heavily on those who loved Faith was the passage of time. By 2021, she would have been 28 years old. Perhaps she would have been in medical school. Perhaps she would have been practicing as a pediatrician, the career she dreamed of. Instead, her parents were left imagining a future that would never exist, sitting in courtrooms where her name was spoken not in joy, but in grief. The road ahead promised to be long. Trials in cases like this could take years. Appeals were possible. And while the arrest had given Faith a voice again, true justice had yet to be secured. For those who knew her, the waiting was unbearable. For those who never met her, the story was still haunting. A reminder of how violence could steal a life filled with promise, and how the system could take years to deliver accountability. Faith's family carried on with quiet dignity. They leaned on faith, on community, and on the hope that one day, a courtroom would deliver the justice she deserved. Until then, the question lingered in every heart. Would the truth be enough to heal? Do you think long legal delays after an arrest help strengthen justice? Or only deepen the pain for families who've already waited too long? As 2022 unfolded, nearly a decade after Faith Hedgepeth's life was taken, her case remained entangled in the slow march of the legal system. The arrest of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares had given her family hope, but what followed was a string of hearings, motions, and delays that tested their patience all over again. Court records showed the prosecution preparing to present its case anchored on the DNA evidence. It was the thread that tied everything together. The semen recovered from the crime scene, preserved for years, and eventually matched to Salguero Olivares. For investigators, it was unshakable proof. But the defense sought to chip away at its power, filing motions that questioned how the evidence was collected, how it was handled, and whether any mistakes had been made during nearly 9 years in storage. Every hearing was a reminder to Faith's family of the violence their daughter had suffered. Sitting in a courtroom, hearing lawyers debate technicalities, was a painful contrast to who Faith had been. A young woman with ambition, kindness, and a future that should have stretched decades ahead. Her parents, Connie and Roland, sat through it all with quiet dignity, though the pain was etched in their faces. The community watched closely. At UNC Chapel Hill, where new generations of students arrived each year, Faith's story remained part of the campus's collective memory. Vigils continued, candles lit for a young woman many of them had never met. Faculty and alumni reminded students that Faith wasn't just a statistic. She had been one of them. Media coverage kept her case alive in headlines. Each update, no matter how small, was reported. A hearing postponed, a motion argued, a date rescheduled. True crime forums dissected every detail, with online followers asking why justice seemed to move so slowly. For many, the delays highlighted the painful gap between an arrest and a conviction. For Faith's family, time was cruel. Her younger relatives grew older without her. Holidays passed with her absence felt at every table. Her parents carried both gratitude for the arrest and frustration at the pace of justice. Connie once said, "It's like we've been running a marathon, and every time we get close to the finish line, someone moves it further away." The emotional toll was enormous. The hope that came with the 2021 arrest had shifted into a different kind of endurance, an exhausting wait for a trial that seemed just out of reach. Still, they held on to faith, believing that justice delayed would not be justice denied. As the 10th anniversary of Faith's death approached in September 2022, her family, friends, and community gathered once more in Chapel Hill. The candles glowed, the prayers rose into the night sky, and her name was spoken with love. But underneath the remembrance was a lingering ache. Nearly 10 years after her murder, Faith's case was still unresolved in court. Do you think the weight of a decade-long wait for justice makes the final verdict more powerful, or does it rob families of true closure? September 7, 2022, marked 10 years since the murder of Faith Hedgepeth. A full decade had passed since the morning she was found lifeless in her Chapel Hill apartment, and still, her case had not gone to trial. For her family, the anniversary was almost unbearable. At vigils on campus, candles flickered in the night air, illuminating the faces of those who had gathered. Some had known Faith personally. Others had only come to know her through her story. Yet all stood together, united by a shared determination. Faith must never be forgotten. Her mother, Connie, spoke to the crowd, her voice trembling. "It has been 10 long years since I've seen my daughter smile," she said. 10 years without her laughter, without her presence. But we will not give up. Faith deserves justice. Her father, Roland, stood quietly beside her, holding a photo of Faith. For him, the weight of 10 years was etched into his expression. He later told reporters that anniversaries felt like reopening the wound, each one reminding him of what had been taken. For Chapel Hill police and investigators, the anniversary was also a reminder of how long they had carried the case. Though an arrest had been made the year before, delays in the court system meant that the fight for accountability was far from finished. The DNA evidence was solid, the case was strong. But trials take time and the wait dragged on. The community felt it too. UNC students, many of whom had been children when Faith died, still knew her story. Professors continued to tell new students about the vibrant young woman whose life had been stolen. Alpha Pi Omega sorority sisters honored her memory with song and prayer, promising that her legacy would not fade. 10 years is a lifetime when you're waiting for justice. By 2022, Faith would have been 29 years old. Perhaps she would have been working in pediatrics. Perhaps she would have been living her dream, caring for children, and giving back to her people. Instead, her parents were left with anniversaries, vigils, and an endless wait. The 10th anniversary was not just a day of mourning. It was also a day of renewed pressure. Advocates called for progress in the courts. Journalists revisited the story. Social media campaigns reignited, demanding that the system move forward. For the Hedgepeth family, justice was not a concept, it was personal. Their daughter had been stolen from them, and while science had identified her killer, the law had yet to deliver closure. Do you believe that the passage of 10 years strengthens a family's resolve for justice, or only deepens the wound left behind? 10 years is far too long for a family to wait for justice. Faith's story must not fade into silence. If you believe her voice deserves to be heard until the very end, stand with her family. Like this video, share it, and subscribe. And don't forget to ring the notification bell. In the months following the 10-year anniversary of Faith Hedgepeth's murder, the pressure on the justice system intensified. The arrest of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares in 2021 had given Faith's family hope, but the trial had yet to begin. Each delay felt like another injustice layered on top of their grief. The DNA evidence was irrefutable. Investigators had preserved it for years, confident it would one day lead to Faith's killer. That belief had been vindicated when the match to Salguero Olivares was confirmed. Still, in the eyes of the law, guilt had to be proven in court. Until then, the Hedgepeth family remained trapped in limbo, knowing who was accused, but unable to see accountability delivered. The community of Chapel Hill also carried the weight of the unresolved case. At UNC, Faith's story was woven into the campus culture. New students arrived every fall, many too young to remember the headlines from 2012, yet they quickly learned her name. Professors, sorority sisters, and campus organizations kept her memory alive, reminding students that she had been one of their own. A student with dreams, ambition, and a future that was violently cut short. Local media continued to follow the case closely, reporting each small development. Pre-trial motions, scheduling conflicts, and procedural hearings filled the headlines, but none of it brought the closure Faith's family longed for. Connie Hedgepeth, her mother, continued to attend vigils and court sessions, often speaking publicly about the emotional toll. "You never get over it," she said. "You just learn to live with the pain. But justice is what we are still waiting for." Her father, Roland, echoed her pain in quieter tones. Each appearance in court was a reminder of the daughter he lost. Each mention of DNA evidence, each legal argument, brought back the horrific memory of the morning she was found. For Roland, anniversaries were no longer markers of time, they were markers of absence. The wider Native American community also felt the loss deeply. Faith had been a proud member of the Wasaponi tribe, a young woman whose education was not just for herself but for her people. Her murder was more than a crime. It was a wound that reached beyond her immediate family, touching an entire community that had looked to her as a symbol of hope. Even with an arrest, rumors and theories lingered. Some questioned whether Salguero Olivares acted alone. Others speculated about motive. The note left at the crime scene, "I'm not stupid, be jealous," remained one of the most puzzling details. Investigators never publicly explained whether they believed he wrote it or what role jealousy may have played in the crime. What was clear, however, was that time had not diminished the demand for justice. 10 years after her death, Faith's case still drew attention. Her name was still spoken, and her story, though heavy with tragedy, carried the enduring message of resilience. The march toward trial was slow, but it was moving forward. For the Hedgepeth family, every step was both a reminder of their loss and a glimmer of hope that one day, justice would finally be delivered. Do you think the slow pace of justice helps ensure fairness in cases like Faith's? Or does it only deepen the pain for families who have already waited too long? As 2023 unfolded, more than a decade after Faith Hedgepeth's murder, the weight of the case still pressed heavily on her family. The arrest of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares had provided a long-awaited breakthrough, but the trial process remained slow, mired in hearings, motions, and procedural steps. For Faith's loved ones, every delay was another painful reminder that justice, though closer than ever, was still out of reach. Court proceedings dragged forward with a frustrating rhythm. Prosecutors reaffirmed their confidence in the DNA evidence, describing it as airtight. Salguero Olivares' defense team countered by filing motions, questioning the handling of evidence, and raising procedural concerns. These were standard tactics in a murder trial, but for Faith's family it was agonizing. Each technicality felt like a cruel stall against accountability. The Hedgepeth family continued to show up. Connie, Faith's mother, sat quietly in courtrooms, listening to the legal arguments, her face marked by years of grief. She often spoke about her daughter not as a case, but as a person, a 19-year-old biology major who wanted to be a pediatrician, who carried the hopes of her family and her Wasaponi community. "She was my best friend," Connie said, "and I just want justice for her." Roland, Faith's father, remained steady but weary. He had stood at vigils for more than 10 years, holding a photo of Faith, speaking her name into microphones, reminding the world that his daughter was more than a victim. But the grind of the legal process weighed on him. Each postponed hearing was like reopening the wound. In Chapel Hill, Faith's memory endured. Each September, students who had never met her lit candles and gathered for vigils. Professors and alumni continued to share her story, ensuring she was not forgotten. On social media, true crime communities tracked the case closely, posting updates whenever new court dates were announced. Faith's name echoed far beyond the borders of North Carolina. One of the enduring mysteries remained the motive. Why had Salguero Olivares attacked Faith? Was it a crime of opportunity? Was there a connection between him and her roommate, or had he simply been in the wrong place at the right time? Investigators remained tight-lipped, but the questions persisted. The chilling note left at the scene, "I'm not stupid, be jealous," remained one of the most haunting clues. To this day, police have never publicly confirmed who wrote it or what it meant. For her family, the questions mattered less than accountability. They wanted the trial to begin, the evidence to be presented, and a verdict to be delivered. The weight had stretched their strength to the limit, but they refused to give up. More than a decade after Faith's life was stolen, the fight for justice continued. Not just in the courtroom, but in every vigil, every interview, every story told in her memory. Do you think the unanswered questions, like the meaning of the note, make the case even harder for families? Or does the simple pursuit of accountability matter more than understanding every detail? By 2023, the fight for justice in the murder of Faith Hedgepeth had become a marathon of endurance. Nearly 11 years had passed since her life was stolen, and though the arrest of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares brought relief, the courtroom journey was only beginning to unfold. The prosecution built its case around the DNA evidence, unshakable, undeniable, and preserved since 2012. The semen recovered at the crime scene tied directly to Salguero Olivares. To investigators, it was the ultimate proof. Yet, the defense sought to counter by questioning every step of the investigation. How the evidence was collected, how it was stored, and whether law enforcement had been too quick to frame the DNA as conclusive. For Faith's family, it was unbearable to hear her story reduced to legal arguments. They had carried her memory for more than a decade, remembering the daughter who wanted to be a pediatrician, who carried the hopes of her Hali-Wasaponi community. To them, Faith was not a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. The court delays only deepened the emotional toll. Each rescheduled hearing felt like dragging the wound open again. Connie Hedgepeth often described her grief as a pain you live with, not one that ever leaves. Her resilience came from her faith, from her community, and from her determination to see her daughter's story through to justice. Roland Hedgepeth, quieter in public, carried his grief like a shadow, standing at vigils with photos of Faith and speaking when words were hardest to find. At UNC Chapel Hill, Faith's name lived on. Annual vigils continued, often attended by students too young to remember the original tragedy. Professors and sorority sisters reminded them of who she was, a young woman with ambition, joy, and a future taken too soon. Her story became a lesson about resilience, about injustice, and about the need to keep fighting for answers even when they take years to arrive. The case remained a topic of national interest. True crime communities followed every development online, with forums dissecting court filings and speculating on motive. The public still wondered about unanswered questions, especially the meaning of the handwritten note left at the crime scene. Was it truly connected to the killer, or was it an unrelated artifact left behind in the chaos? Investigators had never confirmed, leaving the mystery to loom large. For the Hedgepeth family, the focus was not on theories but on justice. They wanted accountability. They wanted the trial to begin and the verdict to be spoken. For more than a decade, they had carried the weight of uncertainty, and now they needed closure. The trial promised to be long, emotional, and deeply painful. Yet, it was the step they had been waiting for, the final leg of the journey to give Faith the justice she deserved. Do you think unanswered mysteries like the note and motive will matter in the trial? Or will the DNA alone be enough to finally bring justice for Faith? By late 2023, more than 11 years after Faith Hedgepeth's murder, the case was finally inching toward trial. For her family, it felt like the moment they had been waiting for since that September morning in 2012. Yet the weight of the years made the anticipation almost unbearable. The prosecution's case remained clear. The DNA collected from the crime scene was a perfect match to Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares. Forensic experts stood ready to testify that the evidence had been preserved, documented, and verified beyond question. Investigators had always said the science would one day bring Faith's killer into the light, and now that light was aimed directly at Salguero Olivares. But in the courtroom, nothing is ever simple. The defense prepared to argue that the DNA evidence, though compelling, should not be seen in isolation. They raised questions about investigative procedures, about whether outside factors could have influenced the evidence, and about whether Salguero Olivares' connection to the crime scene told the whole story. For Faith's loved ones, listening to these arguments was agonizing. Each legal motion felt like a challenge to her memory. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to resonate deeply. At UNC Chapel Hill, students held another vigil, lighting candles for Faith just as they had for more than a decade. Some were too young to remember the early days of the case, but they stood in solidarity, repeating the same vow: Faith will not be forgotten. Professors spoke of her ambition, her kindness, and her dream of becoming a pediatrician. Her sorority sisters honored her as a sister in spirit whose life had been taken but whose legacy endured. The Hedgepeth family carried themselves with strength, though their grief was visible. Connie continued to speak about her daughter in interviews, reminding the world that Faith was not just a victim of a crime, but a young woman full of promise. Roland, quieter but no less determined, stood beside her at vigils and court hearings, carrying photos of Faith like a shield against forgetting. National media returned to the story as the trial approached. Headlines revisited the brutality of the crime, the mystery of the note, and the long wait for justice. For many, the case became a symbol of persistence. How families, communities, and investigators could refuse to let a victim's name fade away. The trial promised to reopen wounds. Faith's family would be forced to hear details no parent should ever hear. They would be asked to sit in the same room as the man accused of ending their daughter's life. Yet, for them, it was a necessary step. After 11 long years, the fight for justice was finally preparing to reach its most critical stage. Faith Hedgepeth's story was never just about tragedy. It was about resilience, hope, and the demand for justice, no matter how long it takes. Do you think the strength of DNA evidence will be enough to secure justice for Faith? Or will the unanswered mysteries, like the note, still haunt the courtroom? Faith's family has carried this fight for more than 11 years. Now, as the trial approaches, her story needs to be heard louder than ever. If you believe her voice deserves justice, stand with her. Like this video, share it so others know her name, and subscribe. Don't forget to ring the notification bell. As the trial of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares drew closer, the weight of 11 years pressed heavily on everyone connected to Faith Hedgepeth's case. For her family, every passing day was a reminder of the daughter they had lost, and of the painful journey that had brought them here. The prosecution prepared a case built on science. The DNA collected at the crime scene in 2012, the semen preserved for nearly a decade, was their foundation. It was strong, indisputable, and supported by expert testimony. For investigators who had carried the case for years, it was the validation they had promised Faith's family from the beginning. The evidence will not lie, but the defense prepared to counter. They filed motions aimed at questioning whether the DNA alone was enough. They probed the handling of the crime scene, the long years between the murder and the arrest, and the gaps in motive. Why Faith? Why that night? And what about the chilling handwritten note found in her apartment? The one that read, "I'm not stupid. Be jealous." Was it connected to Salguero Olivares? Or did it suggest something else? Those unanswered questions lingered. Investigators had never explained the note in full, and the defense hinted it could be used to sow doubt. For Faith's family, it was another painful reminder that justice was rarely straightforward. At UNC Chapel Hill, Faith's memory continued to echo. Each September, new students learned her story, even if they had been children when she died. Professors spoke of her as a bright, dedicated student. Sorority sisters in Alpha Pi Omega honored her as a sister whose light still guided them. At vigils, hundreds gathered, lifting candles high, their faces glowing in the night. The words spoken were always the same. Faith would not be forgotten. For her mother, Connie, the upcoming trial was both hope and heartbreak. In interviews, she said she was grateful for the arrest, but dreaded what the courtroom would bring. "It won't bring Faith back," she admitted, "but maybe it will give us peace." Roland, her father, stood beside her quietly, often holding a photo of Faith. His silence carried its own weight, grief too deep for words. The community braced for the trial as well. News outlets revisited the case in detail, recounting the brutal crime scene, the decade-long wait, and the scientific breakthrough that finally led to the arrest. True crime communities online dissected every update, debating what impact the note, the timeline, and the defense strategy might have. For Faith's family, it was not about theories or speculation. It was about their daughter, about the life she should have lived, about the pediatric career she should have had, about the laughter they should have heard at family dinners. All of it stolen in one night of violence. The courtroom would soon reopen those wounds. And yet, it was the only path to the justice they had carried on their shoulders for more than a decade. Do you think unanswered questions in a case like motive or strange evidence should matter as much as clear DNA proof in the eyes of a jury? In 2023, more than 11 years after the brutal murder of Faith Hedgepeth, the case was finally moving toward trial. For her family, every court date was a collision of grief and determination. They had waited nearly a decade for the arrest of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares, and now they prepared themselves to hear the details of Faith's final hours laid bare in front of a jury. The prosecution's case centered on the DNA, the unshakable thread tying Salguero Olivares to Faith's murder. Experts were ready to testify that the semen recovered at the scene was preserved carefully, tested repeatedly, and confirmed to be his. For investigators, this was the evidence they had clung to for years, the piece of truth that had refused to fade with time. But the defense was not backing down. They argued that DNA alone did not tell the full story. They raised questions about investigative gaps, why it took nearly 9 years to identify Salguero Olivares, why other leads had gone cold, and what role, if any, the note left in Faith's apartment played in the crime. "I'm not stupid. Be jealous." Those words still hovered like a shadow over the case. If Salguero Olivares had written it, why? And if he hadn't, what did it mean? Inside the courtroom, the Hedgepeth family sat with quiet strength. Connie, Faith's mother, often held a photograph of her daughter, her voice breaking whenever she spoke about the girl she had lost. "She was my best friend," Connie told reporters, "and I want the world to know who she was, not just what happened to her." Roland, her father, stayed steady, though his grief was written in the lines of his face. For him, being there was a way of standing beside Faith even after all these years. The community of Chapel Hill rallied as well. At UNC, vigils continued with students, many of whom were too young to remember 2012, lifting candles into the night. Professors spoke about Faith's potential. Sorority sisters honored her with songs and prayers. Even now, more than a decade later, her name carried power. The trial was more than a legal battle. It was a reckoning, a chance to give Faith a voice again. For her family, it was a chance to see accountability delivered. For her community, it was a reminder of how violence can leave scars that ripple for generations. The Hedgepeths had carried their pain for 11 years. They had waited through silence, through unanswered questions, through endless delays. Now, as they faced the courtroom, they carried something else alongside their grief. The hope that justice was finally within reach. Do you believe DNA alone is enough for justice in this case? Or should motive and unanswered questions weigh just as heavily in the jury's decision? Faith Hedgepeth's story has carried through 11 long years of waiting. Her family never gave up, and neither should we. If you believe her voice deserves to be heard until the very end, stand with them. Like this video, share it so more people know her name, and subscribe. And don't forget to click the notification bell. When the trial of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares finally began, the courtroom became the stage for 11 years of grief, frustration, and unrelenting determination. For the Hedgepeth family, every step through the courthouse doors was a reminder of the day their daughter was taken from them. The prosecution opened with the heart of their case: DNA. The semen collected from the crime scene in 2012, preserved carefully for nearly a decade, matched Salguero Olivares without question. Forensic experts walked the jury through the process, explaining how the evidence was gathered, stored, and tested. They told the court that the chance of the DNA belonging to anyone else was virtually impossible. But DNA was not the only piece of the story. Prosecutors described the brutality of the crime scene, the blunt force trauma, the blood patterns, the chaos inside Faith's bedroom. They pointed to the chilling note scrawled on the fast food bag: "I'm not stupid. Be jealous." Its meaning remained unclear, but they argued it reflected rage, jealousy, or both. The defense countered by urging the jury to look deeper. They questioned the handling of evidence, asking whether mistakes could have been made in the 9 years between Faith's death and Salguero Olivares' arrest. They also pressed on motive, suggesting that without a clear reason why he would target Faith, the state's case was incomplete. For Faith's parents, listening to these arguments was excruciating. Connie sat in the courtroom, often clutching a photo of her daughter. "She was my best friend," she had said countless times. And now she was forced to hear her daughter's final hours dissected by lawyers and experts. Roland, her father, remained steady, but the weight of the trial was visible in his expression. For them, it wasn't about legal strategy, it was about the daughter they had lost. The media covered every detail. Local outlets reported daily updates, while national coverage framed the trial as the long-awaited pursuit of justice. On social media, true crime communities dissected each testimony, debating the strength of the evidence and the defense's ability to create doubt. At UNC Chapel Hill, students and faculty followed closely. Faith's sorority sisters, Alpha Pi Omega, gathered in solidarity, reminding the world that she had been more than a victim. She had been a bright, ambitious young woman who dreamed of becoming a pediatrician. Vigils continued, candles glowing in the night, her name spoken with reverence. For many, the trial was about more than just one man's guilt or innocence. It was about the resilience of a family that had waited more than a decade, the persistence of investigators who never gave up, and the community that refused to let Faith's name fade into silence. As testimony continued, one thing became clear: no verdict, no sentence could ever restore what had been taken. But for Faith's loved ones, accountability mattered. It was the final promise they could make to her, to see justice carried out in her name. Do you believe that motive is necessary for justice? Or is the weight of DNA and evidence enough to finally convict Faith's killer? More than 11 years after her murder, the name Faith Hedgepeth continues to echo through North Carolina and beyond. Her story is not just one of tragedy, but of resilience, of a family, a community, and investigators who refused to give up, even when the wait for justice stretched across a decade. The trial of Miguel Enrique Salguero Olivares marked a turning point. DNA had brought him into the light, linking him unmistakably to the crime scene. Prosecutors laid out their case, describing the brutality of Faith's final moments. Forensic experts reinforced what investigators had always believed: the science would speak when no one else could. For Faith's family, sitting in that courtroom was both unbearable and necessary. Connie, her mother, often carried a photo of her daughter, reminding everyone that Faith was not just a victim but a vibrant young woman. Her best friend, her joy, her future. Roland, her father, carried the weight quietly, standing with dignity at every hearing, determined that his daughter's memory would not be forgotten. At UNC Chapel Hill, Faith's presence still lingers. Each year, students gather to light candles in her honor. Many never met her, but they know her name. Professors remember her as a promising student. Sorority sisters in Alpha Pi Omega sing her praises, honoring the sisterhood she embraced. In Hollister, her hometown, Faith remains a source of pride, her legacy tied to her people and her community. The unanswered questions still haunt the case. The note left at the scene, "I'm not stupid. Be jealous," remains a puzzle. What did it mean? Did Salguero Olivares write it? Or was it left by someone else? And what was the true motive for her murder? Some mysteries may never be solved. But for Faith's loved ones, the trial was not about speculation. It was about accountability. It was about honoring the young woman who dreamed of becoming a pediatrician, who wanted to give back to her tribe, who carried her family's hopes into every classroom. Her story is a reminder of how violence can shatter lives, but also of how love, faith, and persistence can keep a memory alive. Faith's family waited nearly a decade for an arrest, and though nothing can bring her back, their determination ensured that her story would not fade into silence. Even now, as the legal process continues, one truth endures. Faith Hedgepeth mattered. Her life mattered. Her dreams mattered. And her name will continue to be spoken. Not just in courtrooms, but in classrooms, in candlelit vigils, and in every heart that has carried her story forward. Faith was more than a case. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a student, a future doctor. And though her life was stolen, her legacy lives on. In memory of Faith and Connie Hedgepeth. This story is dedicated to Faith Danielle Hedgepeth, 1992 to 2012. A proud member of the Holly-Wasaponi Native American tribe and a biology major at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. At just 19 years old, Faith dreamed of becoming a pediatrician. She was known for her intelligence, kindness, and determination to uplift her family and community. We also honor her mother, Connie Hedgepeth, 1964 to 2022, who carried her daughter's memory with strength and grace for 10 years. Connie lit candles at vigils, spoke Faith's name to the world, and never stopped demanding justice. Though she passed before seeing the trial begin, her love and fight for Faith remain an enduring part of this story. Together, their bond reminds us of the power of love, resilience, and community. May Faith's light never fade. May Connie's strength never be forgotten. May justice one day bring peace to their family. After following this story, do you believe justice delayed can still be justice served? Or does the long wait take away part of what justice means? Faith's story has carried across 11 long years, through grief, resilience, and the fight for justice. Her voice deserves to be heard until the very end. If you stand with her family and believe her name must never be forgotten, like this video, share it with others, and subscribe. And don't forget to ring the notification bell, so you'll always be here for stories that give a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves.